Good afternoon. Thank you all for coming. My name is Bei Wu. I'm one of the co-directors of the Aging Incubator. So this is the first of three speaker events featuring actually Tisch faculty. NYU Aging Incubator is a new interdisciplinary university-wide partnership across all NYU schools that was established actually early this year. The Aging Incubator brings together both faculty and the students from all disciplines who are involved in the study of the topics related to aging. The Aging Incubator seeks to facilitate the initiation of path-breaking interdisciplinary research programs and educational endeavors to improve and enhance the day-to-day lives of older adults and address the challenges posed by an aging society. The program has three co-directors. Let me introduce my two other colleagues. Joshua Kodash from NYU Langone School of Medicine. Josh, please. Victoria Revis from NYU Dentistry. Vicky, please. And of course myself, right? From Raleigh Myers College of Nursing. Together, we share leadership, expertise, a broad range of interests, and diverse professional networks. With our partnership with Tisch School of the Arts on the faculty speaker series, we hope to facilitate conversations that highlight aging from different perspectives, break down stereotypes of what it means to age, showcase the value and opportunities of an extended lifespan, and provide research and career avenues for interested students. So the next, we're so pleased to have Karen Nassessian here today to introduce our guests and honor today Richard Schechner and Barbara Schechner and Barbara Browning. So sorry, that's why I'm not a politician. I cannot pronounce last name well.
I'm sure I would murder your name in that.
Okay, so here comes, Karen, please.
Thank you so much for that introduction. As Bei said, my name is Karen Nassessian. I'm the Associate Vice Provost for Strategy and Katie Fleming's Chief of Staff. I'm thrilled to be here today. This is an unbelievable opportunity to get to hear Richard and Barbara. I want to read from my notes because I don't want to forget anything. I just want to say that the Provost is extremely vested in these cross-departmental and cross-school initiatives. I have been in meetings with the three co-directors just as a guest, and I have seen their camaraderie and their chemistry and the way, the collaborative attitude that they have for this topic, and it's really invigorating. So I'm happy to be introducing Barbara Browning and Richard Schechner this afternoon. The speaker series will facilitate conversations that highlight aging from different perspectives. And today, Richard and Barbara will be exploring personal, practical, and literary perspectives on aging in relation to performance studies. Richard is a leader in his profession. He's a founder of the field of performance studies and the performance studies program at Tisch. He is editor of TDR, the Journal of Performance Studies. He's NYU University Professor Emeritus. From 67 to 17, he was a professor and then university professor of performance studies at NYU's Tisch School of the Arts. He is one of the very, very few professors, I actually researched this, there's 4, at NYU who have enjoyed being a university professor for more than 50 years in the history of NYU. Among the many plays Richard has directed are Dionysus in '69, Commune, The Tooth of Crime, Mother Courage and Her Children, Cops, The Marilyn Project, Seneca's Oedipus, Faust Gastronome, Three Sisters, Swimming to Spalding, and Imagining O. Richard has taught, lectured, led workshops, and directed plays around the world. His productions have been seen in China, South Africa, India, Taiwan, Poland, France, and Romania. He's the author of many books, including Public Domain, Environmental Theater, The End of Humanism, Between Theater and Anthropology, The Future of Ritual Performed Imaginaries, and Performance Studies, An Introduction. His books have been translated into 18 languages, and it's very, very impressive. Barbara Browning will ask Richard some questions this afternoon. Barbara is an award-winning novelist, dancer, and cultural critic. She's been teaching for the last 23 years as an associate professor in the Department of Performance Studies at the Tisch School of the Arts. The Department of Performance Studies was established in 1980 as the first of its kind and is ranked #1 for doctoral programs in theater and performance studies by the National Research Council. Barbara writes books of fiction and cultural theory. She's the author of 3 academic books, Samba, Infectious Rhythm, and Caetano Veloso, A Foreign Sound, as well as 3 novels, The Correspondence Artist, I'm Trying to Reach You, and The Gift or Techniques of the Body. Her next book, co-authored with Sébastien Régnier, is coming out in February, Who the Hell is Imre Lordberg? Barbara is also an amateur ukulelist and has created many uke covers, which I've listened to personally and love, which she treats as a conceptual art projects and which she generously shares with others. Thank you for that. So these 2 remarkable speakers are both fascinating people. We're all in for a treat today. And without further ado, please join me in welcoming Richard and Barbara.
Put my notes over here, but as you choose. Okay.
Well, there's the first aging thing. Can't open the bottle. Oops, there you go. All right, we can continue.
Okay.
I want to just say before Barbara begins that, believe it or not, this is totally unrehearsed. I have no idea what question she's going to ask me. I have one piece of writing that I may or may not read. I told her about that. Otherwise, this is raw, which is fun.
Indeed. So yes, it's true. We received an email from the organizers saying, the event's coming up, just wondering if you've got some ideas together. And I was, of course, carefully typing up some questions that I thought I might write to Richard. And Richard answered immediately the email saying, we're good at thinking on our feet, and we don't need to prepare. So I am sort of following suit on that, although I did jot down 1 or 2 things on a piece of paper, just curiosities that I have. I would love to hear Richard speak a little more. But if I could just say, by way of introduction, I was just saying to our colleagues that I said, oh, I have to run off to this event. Richard and I are poster children for how to age inappropriately, which I think that may be what we're here for. But I will also say, indeed, I came here 23 years ago. Richard looked just as spry, young, and mischievous as he does now. And when I first came, I was coming from the English department at Princeton University, and I walked into my first faculty meeting, and Richard was seated in lotus position. And I said, oh, I'm not at Princeton anymore. Here's the well, I was going to say éminence grise, the gray eminence of the field, as you've heard, founder of our field and founder of the department, very much in his body, in the present. And then we later had a discussion. I don't know if this is true anymore, Richard, but I told him that I was able to assume lotus position in headstand, and he could too. I don't know if we both still can, but 23 years ago, 23 years ago we could. So, but he's been really a constant source of inspiration over the time that I've been here of how to keep it new. So I just have to say it's been an honor and a delight to age inappropriately by his side. So, but I do have some questions. Should I start?
Please.
Okay. So it was mentioned that Richard directed a very influential theater piece. I'm sure many of you are familiar with it, called Dionysus in '69. It was actually directed in '68. A totally revolutionary and very important work, as other works of his are, but that one for me really was a watershed moment in experimental theater in this country and in the world. And I won't say too much about it. Maybe he will. But it was such an extraordinary experiment. And looking at it today as a scholar of performance and thinking about what the possibilities are today, what's possible in the theater, the buttons we can push, the places we can go. When I think back to that particular piece, I don't know if I should say I feel disheartened, but it just seems like the amount of experimentation that was possible in that moment and political probing that now feels, there's such a sense of nervousness about about all kinds of things right now. There's a lot of nervousness.
Lack of hope.
Lack of hope, and also fear of experimentation and fear of pushing the wrong buttons. And I just wanted to ask you, Richard, in this moment, I recently went to an exhibit by the wonderful feminist artist Mary Kelly, and it's a piece. The whole exhibit is called Practical History, which is taken from a book by Hayden White, which says basically there are certain historical moments that it's not really about what necessarily happened there, but what they mean to us, what they carry for us. So, and one of her moments is 1968. Another is 2011. She's thinking about Arab Spring, and another is 1940, which was the year preceding her birth. And she's thinking about these historical moments and what they mean to her in her imaginary, and what they it's not necessarily what really happened, but what they provide her with politically, aesthetically. And I would be curious, Richard, to hear how you're feeling about specifically 1968, what you were able to do then, how you're seeing that in relation to this historical moment, or if there are other ways that you, how you think about that.
All right, let me start with why it's Dionysus in 69. Then we'll go back to 68. I often correct it when people write Dionysus in 69 with an apostrophe, as if it's 1969, when I meant the sexual position 69. And of course, I also knew it was the year, but I wanted to make sure that we were eating each other out, aesthetically and socially and actually. And the piece is based on Euripides' The Bacchae, which is the last play in or the next to last play in the Greek canon. It's by Euripides. Actually, Sophocles outlived him by 1 year, and maybe Oedipus at Colonus is 1 year older, but it's right near the end. But it's a play, The Bacchae, of ecstatic female sexuality, in which women rebel, and they take over a city, and they finally slaughter the young king. His mother actually slaughters and dismembers him. And this is both a horror and a celebration. So I wanted to probe into that, and I'll go a little bit back in my history how I got there, but let me stay with this particular time. We opened the play in 68, which was, of course, the year of the Democratic Convention and the year of the movements in Mexico City and Paris and New York, et cetera. And we opened it actually the night that Robert Kennedy was assassinated, and I decided to not delay the opening, but to hold it on that night and to a certain degree dedicated to RFK. And the play shows this ecstatic sexuality, but it also is a cautionary tale. I wrote an essay called The Politics of Ecstasy at about that time, and that phrase, politics of ecstasy, I think I took the title from Timothy, LSD. And, and in the politics of ecstasy, I said, if we are going to dance with Dionysus, we are going to end with our sons' heads on our dancing sticks. And I was aware at that point of the Vietnam War, of course, and I was aware of the many sons' heads on many dancing sticks. And the dancers, as in the play, were old men, but the ones who died were young men. So we were aware of this. At the same time, we were pioneers. So we were the first theater group in what is now called Soho. 33 Worcester Street. It's still there, the Performing Garage. And I named it the Performing Garage. Interestingly, again, people often say the Performance Garage. And I bristle at that. It's the Performing Garage, meaning not it's a place where performances take place. It is in itself a performance. So one of the things that is a fundamental thing for me from this appearance today to anything else is that we are constantly performing. There is no such thing in a certain way as a performance, except as a kind of fossilized relic of performing. And what interests me theoretically, of course, is to analyze this notion of performing. All right, so you might ask inappropriately, why didn't I call it performing studies? And probably I should have, but I'm you know, what did Santayana say? Consistency is the hobgoblin of small minds. So I'm not particularly consistent, and I'm not embarrassed about being inconsistent. At any rate, so we did this play, which had the following firsts in it in terms of shock, and then I will tell you a little bit more about it. It was the first time that there was full frontal nudity. I hate the word, so you always said nakedness, of both men and women. So you saw breasts, you saw, you know, pubic areas of the women you don't see inside their vaginas. You saw penises, and that kind of thing had just not been seen on, in New York theater. It was done in a style I called environmental theater, which I had pioneered elsewhere. I did have a life before I got to New York, a quite full one. And in the environmental theater, there's no such thing as a stage. In other words, this setup of a room is a kind of anathema to me. I won't, I am a guest, so I'm not going to change it. But if this were my room, we'd be sitting in varieties of circles. The idea that you're all looking in this direction and see each other, back of each other's heads, is just catastrophic for conversation. And it's not the way things should be. If you are belonging to an organized church, if you are belonging to a patriarchal or matriarchal, in the bad sense, authoritarian situation, then you want to be in that way, because obviously we are the center of attention. You're looking at the back of each other's heads for the most part. If you come to discuss things, you will have a harder time. But I would have, and I always do, arrange things in circles somehow. So environmental theater is a theater in which there's no particular center space, and in which things happen all over. So there was this nakedness, there was this environmental theater staging, there was playing with Euripides, the text, and people got upset about this also. So we performed between the given text of William Arrowsmith's translation of Euripides and our own improvisations and interpolations, so that, for example, the god, Dionysus, since he's a god, can say anything, because gods can say anything. So he would say, I'm Bill Finley. And the king, who I said, you have to stay to the text because you're rigid, would say, no, you're Dionysus. And Finley would say, and you're Bill Shepherd. He says, no, I'm Pentheus, king of Thebes. And Finley would look around at the audience and say, this is absurd. It's an actor. It's Bill Shepherd. I work with him all the time. The audience starts to laugh at him. And Shepherd would get really upset about it in a real sense. So I wanted to also bring that kind of thing in. Later I developed that further with Spalding Gray and Elizabeth LeCompte and other people, because the performance group morphed into the Worcester group, which is still in the Performing Garage. So it had this kind of participatory involvement, and it had this tension between the classic and the contemporary, and the sense that the contemporary should take the glass of the classic and break it and see what happens out of that. When you break the glass of the, well, to use another great poet, Byron said that eternity is the stain, is the shattering of the glass, and therefore we see the full panoply of the rainbow when the dome of eternity shatters. And that is the artist's mission, isn't it? To shatter in some small way the dome of eternity, to show us the shards in different colors of our imperfect yet striving for life. All right, so this play was designed to get at some of that, and some of it did get at. The other thing it had that was first, was the first time that two men actually kissed on stage, full, you know, tongue and mouth, Al Franken kisses. And so they were And this was shocking to people. I also rotated roles. That was never done before. In the book, it shows that everybody played every role, because I was very much for not just speaking about participatory democracy, but embodying it. Now, there's a paradox there, because I also was the god on the outside, and I did not share all of my power, and there's lots of stories about that. But within the frame of the play, I did a great deal. So a woman played Dionysus at one point, a woman played Pentheus. People went across. Our group was, of course, mixed in their sexual practices and orientations, and we just rotated all of the roles, and we closed the play after about a year because we wanted to do something else. It was always sold out. That was because the very first review it got from the New York Times said that anyone interested, it said, this is strong stuff, but anyone interested in where the theater is going has got to see it. So that sealed that. We just never had an empty seat. The play also sometimes didn't finish because it was a Dionysus game. Dionysus was trying to do something, and if he didn't accomplish it, he lost and Pentheus won. This happened occasionally. Sometimes people came and kidnapped people from the thing. There was a deep interpenetration between ordinary life and the play. Now, let's go back to the broader scope a little bit of 1968. If you check the pages of TDR, the journal I edit, I began editing it in 1962 when it was the Tulane Drama Review in New Orleans. And the founding editor was Robert W. Corrigan, who brought it from the Carleton College, where it was the Carleton Drama Review. Corrigan then later came to New York University, where he was the first dean of the Tisch School of the Arts. And it's because of Corrigan that I became editor of TDR, because when he left Tulane, the Tulane faculty hired me to take his place. And then when he came to New York, and I quit Tulane, me and 5 others, and it was a totally different academic scene. No one needed to keep a job in academia. There were many more jobs than there were positions. So 5 of us resigned because we were pissed off at the administration. And we all got other jobs, and I got a job at NYU. And I brought TDR with me, which they wanted to do. Tulane wanted to get rid of it, and we brought it here. If you look at the issue of TDR in 1968, you'll see that there's an ad in that issue for what is called the Festival of Life, Grant Park, during the Democratic Convention. And the address for the Festival of Life, Jerry Rubin and Abby Hoffman, is the TDR office. So the TDR office was the center of the Radical Theater Repertory Grant Park Chicago demonstrations. Now, why didn't Richard Schechner go to Chicago? I knew it was going to be a mess. I had been arrested sometimes in my life for the freedom movement, and that's a whole other story. My work in the Free Southern Theater in Mississippi during Freedom Summer, and so on and so forth. There's a lot of work there, and I was the first white, one of the 2 first whites to be arrested for a sit-in in New Orleans. I also protested the loyalty oath while I was in the Army, and the Army investigated me. I have a very thick and amusing FBI file, Freedom of Information file, in which one of the really funny things was that they said that Schechner made a specific trip to New York from New Orleans to visit with known communists, the Moscow Art Theater. So, well, it didn't get a laugh here, so you probably don't know who the Moscow Art Theater is, but they're about as known communists. I mean, they were the descendant, they were Stanislavski's theater. They were not much involved in politics. At any rate, and they spelled Tulane, T-W-O-L-A-N-E, as if it were that kind of, so you can read. I'm glad about that. At any rate, I was involved in these various political activities, going back to the time that I was an undergraduate. One of the privileged things I had is that in 1954, there was the case called Brown v. Board of Education. This is what overturned Plessy v. Ferguson, which ended segregation in the public schools, which we can say is the legal basis for things that were still playing out. Not since Reconstruction had there been such a thing, and that case was very important. And I was a very young man at that time. I was a boy, I wasn't a man. And I was interested in this. I was writing for it for the Cornell Daily Sun, and I decided to speak to the lawyer, Turned out that that was Thurgood Marshall. And I wrote to Mr. Marshall, and he said, come on down. If you want to meet with me, you have to come to my office in Harlem, which I did. And we spent a good afternoon together. And we liked each other, or at least I liked him, and I think he liked me. I have further evidence that he did. And I wrote a series of articles for the Cornell Daily Sun as a young man. Later on, when Little Rock was integrated, you know, Faubus standing in the gate, I was the only white person with those black kids at that time in the basement when they went across the street and the National Guard got them in, because Marshall had written to Daisy Mae Bates, who was the local head of the NAACP in Arkansas, and said, you should let this white boy in, he's okay. And so I had a deep involvement with that. And as I said, I did the first teach-in against the Vietnam War, but I did more. I used to disrupt ROTC parades on the Tulane campus. I was able to disrupt them effectively because, and this is one of the paradoxes of my life, I volunteered for the Army. I was not drafted. I volunteered. I signed up. And why did I sign up? I signed up because I felt at that point in my life, I was already 25, I had a master's degree, I didn't want to go on for a PhD at that time. I wanted to see how other people then, middle class, fairly well-off Jewish intellectuals, the people I was hanging out with, lived. So and they offered me an officer, you know, a second lieutenant, because there was already a master's and so on. And I was doing what is called volunteering for the draft. If you volunteer for the draft, you go down to the draft board, there was a draft, and you say, take me today. They were very happy to do that, fill their quota, but you got certain choices. I turned down that commission, and I wanted to go in as an ordinary person. I became a specialist first class. I did lots of propaganda writing for the United States, and that's a whole other set of stories. And, but they also started to investigate me because they felt that I was too old, I was too radical, I should not have been, you know, I was doing something, and also I formed a bowling team in the Army, which had the post-adjutant general at Fort Hood, and the Jewish chaplain, and artist Muldoon Elder, and Paul Schmidt, who later I re-encountered as a great Russian translator, and he was working on Russian materials in the Army at that point, in the intelligence thing. So they thought that this bowling team was some kind of red cell. Now I have to say, because I'm sure that it's obviously being recorded, but beyond the recording that we're recording, we have to also assume that the panopticon is forever operative, that I never was a member of the Communist Party, though I did hate Roy Cohn with the rest of us. And certainly I lean on the left, and if I have a certain kind of politics, it's a kind of neo-Marxist politics, though it's a little more messy than that. So all of this to kind of situate some of what you were talking about, because if this is about aging, aging begins when you're born. And aging begins when you're able to make certain choices. And I do believe that, of course, I believe paradoxically in absolute determination. You know, there's a kind of a physical determinism that's built into the nature of quantum mechanics, indeterminacy determinism. And there's a certain kind of, if, you know, the French have this phrase, tout comprendre, tout pardonner. If you understand everything, you pardon everything because you realize that everything is inevitable. Or as Sartre said, upon the death, I don't remember of who, but death transforms a life into a destiny. In other words, it couldn't have been otherwise. That's true, but it's also true that we live in a kind of Brechtian world in which we make and are able to make choices and influence the way we move down the streams of life, and also can influence life. So it's one of those deep contradictions that we are determined, but we are free. As Milton said, and I have most of my degrees are in English. I have one degree in theater, which was late on, but you know, we are sufficient to stand, but free to fall, which means that we are given enough to be who we are, but we also have the liberty to be who we are not. I'll stop there.
So he'll pause there. So when we first came in, we were speaking with the organizers of the event about the way that this project, the Aging Incubator, started, what that very name means, and you just kind of touched on that. And Joshua said, well, that the charge was to do something about the aging problem, that aging problem, and so I thought about that because, well, it's interesting, of course. Would we say the problem of childhood, or the problem of youth, or the problem of middle age, or the problem of aging? And of course, part of the problem of aging is thinking of aging as a problem, although at the same time one doesn't want to be too Pollyanna-ish about it, because there are some specific things that, I certainly wake up and complain about my lower back and my eyesight and all kinds of other things. And then there are more serious things that we confront, including ideas about mortality and, getting closer to that end of things. So the problem of aging, when I said that we were going to come in and we were going to be poster children for inappropriate aging, I didn't know that he was going to launch right in on sexuality, but that for me is a topic, actually, that's a very interesting thing to think about. And we may want to talk more about that. I wouldn't mind. But there are... Is that funny?
But what I did.
What's
you
that?
said, and I went.
Oh. I told you, inappropriate.
Well, at least I didn't go for the microphone.
Yeah. But so this question of the problem of aging and whether the problem. So one way of thinking about it, of course, is that the problem of aging is thinking of it as a problem, which would be ageism. We could talk about it in political terms. What does it mean to think of people as they get older as being a problem, a social problem? What does it mean to think of ourselves as having a problem of getting older? And I don't know, Richard, if you want to go there with this question of your own feelings about that, to what degree?
Well, yes.
Yeah.
Let's say that for a certain amount of my life, and I assume other people have it also, I live in a bubble of immortality and a bubble of now is forever now. At a certain other point, when I had certain health problems, when I saw and experienced friends dying, when I could look at the calendar and say the possibility of me being alive 30 years from now, in 20, whatever 30 years from now is scant, then that bubble bursts and you begin to come face to face with death. And the question is, what kind of death? As I said earlier, we are always dying from the moment of our being born, and the parallel identical opposite is always true. We are always living up till the point when we are not. So that there's a kind of, if it's a rectangle, there's a box, and it goes like this. So here at the birth, there's a very little life lived, and there's a huge amount of life to be lived. As you move further and further up, there is more life lived and less life to be lived. And finally, at the end, there's no life to be lived, and it has been lived. So you have to see that and begin to see how you're going to engage with it. Now, I like to think of myself as a young 83. I'm 83. But what does that mean? It means that what is really important to me is psychophysical health, not just physical health. I'm not interested in being Stephen Hawking. I mean, I respect him, and et cetera, and he necessarily made his choices. Of course, he didn't choose his condition. But that probably would, were I faced with that, I would not have been as brave as he. I probably would have killed myself. So I need a certain kind of physical engagement as well as a mental engagement. And one, I feel, can take steps to maintain one's physical and mental engagement. It's not, one need not be passive. You know, you don't have to be Dylan Thomas at the very end and rage against the dying of the light. You need to rage against the dying of the light early in the day. And you do this by training. And you do this by various kinds of training. If I were to say, you know, what was in it. I've lived a life, I realize, of extraordinary coincidences and opportunities that very few people have had. And I could look at that and say, yes, it was just serendipity. But it may not have been entirely serendipity either. So one of the serendipitous moments was when I arrived in Chennai, Madras at that time, in 1971. And how I got there is another interesting serendipitous story. But I arrived there, and I said, you know, there are two things I want to do. I want to observe the dance training at Kalakshetra, which is a place where they were teaching Bharatanatyam and classical Indian dance, and I wanted to research that. And I want to study yoga. Take me to a yoga teacher. And they took me to a teacher. Now, some of you may know Iyer Nagar's book, Light on Yoga. Does anybody know this book? It's a very well-known book. At any rate, his teacher was Krishnamachari, and Krishnamachari became my teacher. It was life-changing. And Krishnamachari and I hit it off, let's put it that way. And I learned, and I have a notebook, my yoga notebook, where I wrote down all the asanas as he taught them to me. And finally, he said I could teach other people. Now, I've never taught yoga professionally, but I have taught it to the people I've worked theater with, and I also do pranayama and breathing. The thing is that at that point, when I began yoga, this is the upside-down headstand and so on, and lotus position while on head. I don't do it because of my neck, not because I think I probably could do it otherwise, but I need to lose a few more pounds before I put that much weight on my neck. At any rate, yoga, it comes from the Sanskrit. It's related to the English word yoke. It means to put together two things that are not usually together, and it means the psychophysical. In other words, yoga assumes that in doing certain kinds of physical things, you are also doing spiritual meditative things, and it assumes that in doing meditative things, you are doing physical things. You cannot do them separately, or you, of course, cannot. You ought not. If you do them separately, you're not doing either. That's what yoga would say. And I learned that lesson during the time that I studied with him. And I carried it forward so that I still practice yoga rigorously, but I also lift weights and I do cardio and that kind of stuff. And as you can see, I exercise my memory, not simply remember my memory, not only about myself, but about, the poetry and about philosophy, et cetera, whatever I read. The second thing in this regard, Erik Erikson, who is a great psychologist, I feel, wrote a book called Identity in the Life Cycle. I recommend it to you. It's a short little book. And in Identity in the Life Cycle, he gives choices. I was going to bring it in today, but I didn't. But choices that one makes throughout life. And at the final moments of life, he says the choice is between wisdom and despair. One either goes in the direction of wisdom, in the direction of Moses up the mountain, or what have you, in the direction of Martin Luther King, who never had an old age, but he had an old person's vision to see, I see the land. He had a Mosaic vision, which was the vision of the land which one could not enter for whatever reasons. In the Bible, Moses' reason is because he killed someone early on, and he also broke the tablets and so on and so forth. But he could see and he could lead people to it. These are profound stories to me because it shows that our own gifts are limited and our impact exceeds our abilities, or as I've forgotten, it was Keats probably says, our reach exceeds our grasp. So wisdom or despair. And Erikson says, you make your choice. It's not simply, this is what's going to happen to you. So I know I probably sound too much like a preacher, but given this opportunity of aging incubation, the idea is, are you going to move towards wisdom, or are you going to move towards despair? And I would say that even though that's the old person's choice, that comes earlier on. We face, we face Donald Trump, and behind him Pence, and behind him Paul Ryan. We face Ray, more, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We face racism, sexism, all of it. Are we going to go into despair or wisdom? Well, despair is easy. We know what despair is like in that. What is wisdom in relationship to these things? Well, you can take the wisdom of the length of things, that this too shall pass, as indeed it is. Rome passed, everything passes, so that's a kind of despairing wisdom. Or you can say that through a certain kind of activism, one can engage an alternative way of being, and it does not have to be majoritarian. It need only exist, and exist where it exists. If there were underground cells during World War II in fascist-occupied Europe, then certainly we're a long way from that, and we can have our cells of progressivism, unembarrassed progressivism, you see, unencumbered. So my wisdom advice to the younger people is that, you know, if you rein yourself in and say, I need to protect what I have because if I lose it, I've lost so much, you will have already lost it. That you need to take the commitment and risks involved in moving forward to a certain kind of active wisdom. I don't know if that answers anything, but
Yeah. I'm going to push it a little further.
okay.
Partly because
And stop me from preaching.
No, I'm into your preaching, Richard. We were talking about the phrase aging incubator, and Richard pointed out that it sounds counterintuitive. And when you drew my attention to that phrase, it reminded me of, there's a beautiful song by Lassa de Sela. Do people know her music? She died tragically in her early 40s of breast cancer just a few years ago. And she was a wonderful Mexican-American singer, songwriter. And there's a song, I'm trying to remember exactly what the title is. I think it might be Too Small. And in the song, I saw her perform it live. And what she said was that her father used to tell her that just as when a baby is in the womb, at a certain point, you know, it's very comfortable in there, it feels great. And then at a certain point, it's too small, and the baby has to come out of the womb. And so she said that her father explained to her that the end of life was this moment when the world was too small. And she sings, you know, soon this world will be too small. This was, she wrote the song before she knew that she was going to die so tragically early, but it's a you know, very beautiful configuration. And we were speaking earlier about, Richard, your coinage of the term intercultural, and we were talking about different cultural notions of what constitutes aging, if it's a problem, how we see that, and also different cultural configurations of mortality itself. And one of my students from a class I'm teaching this semester is here and knows that I drew on the board at a certain point. I was talking about something that in Congo culture is called the Congo cosmogram, which shows a kind of a cyclical notion of life. And I mapped out for my students, you know, oh, here, you're at the peak, and I'm already going, you know, over the edge. But the good news is that it comes back around down here on the bottom, and then we come back around. So, of course, there are all kinds of different cosmological configurations about mortality that could give one hope or make one think in a more circular sense or with less finitude. You know, that one that I mentioned from the song of Lassa de Sela, I don't think that that's from any particular cosmology. I think that was her father's way of telling the story, which is a kind of a wonderful configuration. But I'm tempted just to press you maybe a little bit more because you said you had this text. Can I can I press you on that?
Yeah, I will read it because I like it. But I just want to say before I do, I also think of worlds without end. So I do not have inside myself any sense of ending except the notion that not ending is an illusion. As I said, I'm not uncomfortable with contradictions. So I know that I will end, but I don't experience myself as ending. with that in mind, I will read you a page and a half. The context of this is that on October 27th, which was to the day the 13th year, 70th year rather, and 13 of my bar mitzvah, which is an important rite of passage in Judaism. On October 27th, 1947, I was bar mitzvah. On October 27th, 2017, for the third time, the motherfuckers opened my chest and replaced my aortic valve. Now, the first two times, you know, you would think once is enough, were more or less experimental. This is a kind of a lesson here. We're experimental. So one was kind of minimally invasive, and they spread my ribs. They went in, they replaced the valve with a pig. I should have known. And they replaced the valve with a pig, and it lasted 10 years. They promised me 20, it lasted 10. Then they said, this is the NYU Langone, I like them very much. Then the people there said, let's try a TAVR, a cathartic aortic valve replacement. In other words, they go in through your thigh, your groin. They send a camera in one. They send this little umbrella with a new pig in with the other, and you're not entirely out, which I like. So I'm watching this as these things are going up in through my artery. I'm very curious. So I'm watching, and they get it in there, and they explode this thing, and I now have a new valve. 20 minutes later, I was walking. Oh, it was a miracle, except it only lasted 9 months. And by last summer, my aortic valve was leaking. So, being a graduate of Cornell, I went to the Weill Cornell Medical Center. Yeah. So, Weill Cornell is up at Presbyterian, and they have a doctor there called Leonard Girardi, who's supposed to be one of the best of this kind of thing. And I met first with his assistant. His assistant was right. I said, I want to meet Dr. Girardi. I met Dr. Girardi. Maybe he looked at my bio. He didn't. I said, I want you to operate on me. If you operate on me, I'm going to do it. Otherwise, what they said is this leaky valve will continue. I can have from 5 to 7 to 10 years of more life, probably, and I will finally die of congestive heart failure if I don't die of stupidity before then. Or I can roll the dice, and he said it's 95% sure that this would work, and we will give you a cow this time, a cow valve. And but I only do the classic, which is, you know, the splitting of the sternum. So they split my sternum. Needless to say, I'm sitting here, so the operation was a success, but there were some complications. The surgeon often is not the one who sews it up, and whoever sewed me up made certain mistakes or whatever. Surgeons never say they make mistakes. They're kind of like football coaches. So at any rate, I still have a hole here. At one point, I had a hole that was like 5 centimeters long and 5 centimeters deep. I felt like a standing rib roast, and I had to have the dressing changed every day. I still change it. I do it every part of it. At any rate, when I came out of the operation, I didn't know what it was that was happening, and my loved one says I was on morphine, I was on this and that, and I came out, and I had what I'm going to read. Now, how did I get this? As soon as I was compos mentis, in other words, very shortly after having this vision, I dictated it. I have dragon naturally speaking. It's a very good thing. So I dictated it to myself. So here it goes. I am in a room whose walls and ceiling are of pressed stainless steel, but a steel that is a rich brown. My consciousness flowed into this room, pressing against its edges. I opened my eyes wide and saw lights through cracks in the walls, ceiling, and floor. I peered a little closer. The lights were orange, like flames, but not hot. They were small orange rectangles, windows. 1 or 2 windows opened wider and inviting me to pass through and into something else again. I needed to resist this something else. I knew that. I knew that what I was looking at was an existence after death, maybe my own dying, or the fires of hell, the undiscovered country from whose bourne no traveler returns. I was so drawn to going there, but I stopped. I thought of Dante and the Inferno, of Virgil leading the poet down the rings of hell. I recognized deeply inside myself the need for one poet to lead another, for a guide in this land at whose border I stood and which beckoned me to give my whole self, never to return. I didn't exactly fight this feeling, but I didn't give in to it either. I knew that giving in would be the end of something, and I wasn't ready yet to end. Dante needed a guide in, through, and out of the world of his culture, a world with its particular shape and form. I also needed a guide, but could find no one at this moment. I couldn't bring myself to leave these windows opening to the fiery landscape beyond, or maybe it was a bright dancing city beyond. But I couldn't stay where I was either. For a long time, at least in my recollection of what happened, I was suspended in this room of stainless steel and rectangles of flame. Maybe only a few minutes passed while I was in a hallucinatory stupor, but that only explains it at the level of rationality, my culture's explanation of things. What I was having was not rational. It was an out-of-body experience, a mystical experience, a confrontation with reality beyond myself in a very profound way. It wasn't like taking LSD or peyote or anything else I had done earlier in my life. It was unique, scary, and extraordinarily seductive at the same time. At this point, I had no pain. I hardly had any consciousness of my actual body. I was exploring with my astral body, sending my protoplasm out and withdrawing it, going to the edge but very carefully keeping from tipping over, falling in, rushing through. I did not want to pour myself out of that room into some other reality from which I could not return. Over time, I woke up. I experienced the actual ICU, the bustle of the nurses, the beeping of the various machines keeping track of blood pressure, heart rate, body temperature, and who knows what else. I realized that I was connected to at least one intravenous bag that was feeding me my meds. I knew that I was catheterized, peeing drop by drop into another bag. I sensed a large tube in my neck. I really never got to see how big it was until a few days later when they took it out of my jugular vein. I was under an oxygen mask. I was a regular patient. So what's your reaction to some of this?
Yeah.
How does it feel to still be working 50 years at this point?
Well, you know, for me, work and play are the flip sides of the same coin. So you should be just as well asking, how does it feel to still be playing after all this time? In one of the things I'm trying to write, I distinguish between work and labor. Labor is that which one does and does not wish to do. Work is what one does and one wishes to do. Playing and working are very close to each other. If you're an artist, your playing becomes your working. If you're a teacher, your playing becomes your working. So it feels to me like a continuation. When I was asked to retire from teaching at NYU and to become emeritus, I resisted that. And the truth be told, the only reason I accepted it is because they gave me a golden handshake and loaned me enough money to buy an apartment or part of it. If they had not done that, I would not have done it. So it was not like, gee, I can't wait to retire. It was, gee, I want to own an apartment. So I know what the world is made from. At the same time, when September 1st rolled around and I was no longer teaching, I felt both a liberation and a reduction. At the same time, I made arrangements that I would be teaching. In January 2019, in Paris, for NYU Abu Dhabi, I will do a J term at a very good salary. So I will be teaching. So I'm looking forward to that. but it'll be confined. I won't be directing dissertations anymore. I'm glad not to be writing letters of recommendation, which I find to be necessary, ritualized bullshit, which tells the truth, but it doesn't really tell the truth. And having been on the other side of reading these letters, you think you're going to hire a Nobel Prize winner each time. So the inflation, you know, the inability in writing letters of recommendation to actually evaluate what's happening. You know, if you're a medical doctor and gave letters of recommendation as your diagnosis, nobody would ever be sick. So at any rate, so I don't regret the profound institutional hypocrisy of the department I was a member of. There's going to be a celebration of my departmental career on February 19th, and I'm preparing a talk for it, which is going to be, it's called The Real History of Performance Studies. It's going to be quite different than what my colleagues think, and I'm not going to give any preview to it, but I'm working on it. And it's not insulting, but it's not the myth. It's not the myth that people think it is, or is put out to be. So there are certain aspects of retirement that I like. The ability to say what I've just said, because I now have a robo response. I am now Professor Emeritus. I will be editing TDR, but I will no longer be writing letters of recommendation, even to people who are very close to me. So that's good. Okay, other hands are going up. Anyways, it's a mixed bag. I don't like the term emeritus. It's more or less what you put on a tombstone, but I accept it.
You know, it's sort of interesting to me. I was thinking about what you read and how you were feeling. I don't know if this really links up to it, but I do know that probably in the last maybe 5 years, I'm 68 now, okay? In the last 5 years, I have spent a lot of time sitting there going, how is it possible that I'm not going to exist? You know what I mean? And I don't really, I'm sure we all have this. I'm sure we all think of this. And I just wonder, you were in a space that you were existing and you were almost not existing, it sounded like to me. What do you think of having these thoughts at this point?
Well, you know, I quote Shakespeare, and I could have quoted also that life is that period of consciousness between two great sleeps. And Shakespeare is always a good, Shakespeare and the Greeks, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, some of Japanese writings, there are certain things that are really profound. So I don't have much of a problem because I know I and it won't exist. And I kind of delight myself in saying, what are they going to do with all those books in my study and all that stuff? And yet I know that once I'm gone, I, the self that is Richard Schechner, the person who is now speaking to you, will be gone except as residue. And residue is a little bit different. You know, my books, my works, my students, all those things which are residue. But the actual engine of my existence will have stopped. I have no problem with that. I don't want it to happen, but I have no problem with that. It is in the same, and now here's some really grandiose thing. It's in the same league with what was before the Big Bang. So if you're going to be an atheist, as I am, and I'm a Jewish, Hindu, Buddhist atheist, and again, I do these rituals and all, but I feel that, you know, the Bible is correct, except that it got it stood it on its head. It's not that man was created in God's image. God was created in man's image, man, and then it changed. So, but it's basically the right equation. It just had the integers on the wrong side. So the problem of the Big Bang is, yes, the world and time and Einsteinian all came into existence 16 billion years ago, boom. And of course one asks, what about before that? And the answer is, there is no before that. Time doesn't exist. So in other words, there is no answer to that question. So I say my own existence is my own, I guess, my parents' Big Bang, and which resulted in me, or maybe a little one. You know, and it's no accident that they called the thing the Big Bang. They mean the fuck that started the existence. I'm sure that was in the physicist's mind. How can you use the word bang and not think bang? So these things are there. So what was before that? A glimmer in the Almighty's eye.
Vicky is no. Oh, I thought you were going to say it was time. Oh, okay. Oh, we're okay for time. Oh, okay, fine. Because I was going to say he started inappropriately and he ended inappropriately, but in fact he didn't end. He didn't end. There's more. So yeah, please.
There's a phrase that youth is wasted on the young. In your life, looking back now, are there choices you would have made differently, or decisions that you regret?
Sure, and I won't share them.
I'm also a fellow atheist, and it's wonderful to hear you speak so openly about it like that. The French have a saying called putain envie de vivre, which is this lust for life. And I don't buy what you're saying in terms of you're comfortable with the idea, and I understand on a very intellectual level you might be, but you are life. You are the very essence of life. How do you convince yourself that in 20 years, with all the other agents provocateurs that will be out there, you will not be part of that?
Well, first of all, I'm sure I'll live to 108, because 108 is a very powerful number. So that's my destiny. When I get to 108, I will have gotten to my Big Bang. We'll see what happens. But don't count me out until 108. Now, when I was coming out of this, not when I had this and wrote this, but when I came home, there were certain moments when I really didn't care whether I lived or died. The pain was so intense. The uncomfortability. Now I can move a little bit. Things were not working. The doctors, they didn't lie to me, but they didn't tell me the intensity of this experience. It was like 100 pounds to lift my foot. I had to walk down the hallway. I couldn't do it. The physical therapist said, lift your foot. I don't want to lift my foot. You're not going to get better unless, whole lots of things. And I knew that, again, in Pilgrim's Progress, Bunyan's great book, there's a slough of despair, it's called. It's kind of like Drain the Swamp, but it's the swamp, it's a slough, not a sloth, a slough, a kind of swamp of despair. And it's in there. I discovered that I have some of that, but I also have the Richard Schechner you're now seeing. And my wife, who is not given to praising me often or even ever, said, she said two things. You are very brave and you're very tough. And I'm going to cry about that because it means a great deal to me. So something in me, some fiber in me, was not yet ready to go here. It was ready to bring you a report from the edge, but it was not ready to go there because then you would not have this report. And you ask whether I have a sense of ending. Of course I do intellectually, but it's the same as the way I feel about the world. I feel about the whole world from the point of view of the mind, that it's really down the tubes. Environmental degradation, the governments that are hateful, overpopulation, you can name it. The world is not going in a good way. We would be better off to have the asteroid come and do us in and let whatever to come next do better. But my gut, where I do my yogic breathing, no, very optimistic. Will not give it up. I'm looking forward to supper tonight and whatever else might be out there. So again, my one piece of maybe profound advice is do not be afraid of these contradictions. Do not try to resolve them, but take that road and take that road and go on both of those roads and let the devil decide which is correct and which is not correct, or they alternate, or something of this sort. I mean, when I first discovered Heisenberg's indeterminacy principle, I don't understand the physics of it, of course, nor do I understand the physics of how a particle can be here and there at the same time. but I understand the poetry of it. And the poetry of it is that you can measure this or you can hold that. If you're measuring this, you can't hold that. If you're holding that, you can't measure this. So that's kind of like the scholar and the artist. The scholar is measuring, the artist is holding. So if you're going to take a work and really measure it and write about it and do it, all right, then in a certain sense you destroy it by, you can't hold it. If you're going to hold it, you can't measure it. But we each, I feel, have the capacity to both hold and measure, to be in two places at the same time, to be indeterminate in the brave way, to be ethical and selfish, let's put it that way. And we need to not be embarrassed by that, or to make those claims, or to act on it. Again, to younger colleagues, I say, you know, when I was faced, I decided early on that I would never, somebody asked about work and labor, I would never do anything I didn't want to do. Now that doesn't mean, you know, I won't do little things I don't want to do, like serve on tenure committees and things, but I mean in any profound way, I would simply not do it. When I first came to the NYU School of the Arts, to David Oppenheim, was the second dean after Corrigan. He said, okay, we're going to do it. I said, you're getting in me a kind of peculiar person. I'm not going to serve on any of your committees. I'm not going to do any of it. You fire me if you want to, but what I'm going to give you is a lot of books, a lot of this. You'll have a lot of reputation. I'm worth it to you, but don't ask me to do anything at that level. Okay, so then he accepted that for a while. Then we were rotating the chair of the department, and it became my turn to become chair. All right, for a year I'd serve as chair. This was long before I see Karen back there and long before BKG and all. So the dean had meetings. I hated those meetings, so I sent my graduate assistant to the meetings. So the heads of the departments were always showing up, and who happened to be a very brilliant woman who made a great career for herself, Kate Davey, but at any rate, she would show up and represent me. Of course, I'm smart, so I didn't say I'm not going. I'm saying I'm busy. I have a dentist appointment. I can't be here, you know. But he saw through it. I'd never show up. And finally, he called me into his office, and he says, Richard, you know, you're treating this like a sinecure. I said, it is a sinecure. That's why I accepted tenure. It's exactly that. And then he said, but you can't, it embarrasses me that you are, you know, people see that you're never attending these meetings. I said, then relieve me of being chair. And then you'll have somebody who'll do it. It's not what I'm cut out to do. So I realize that we're not in the same situation now. People really need the jobs, et cetera, et cetera. But find in yourself the courage to say, is this going to nourish me? Not in it may sound supremely narcissistic and selfish, but I'm talking about something that hopefully is a little more than primary narcissism and primary selfishness. It is the ability to do one's work and to not let things stop one from doing one's work. Not to say, I will do this for 3 years in order to do that. Not to suffer Jacob and Laban. You know, when Jacob came to marry, Laban said, you have to work for me 7 years and you'll get the bride of your choice. He worked 7 years. They married. When he pulled up the veil, it was Leah. It was not Rebecca. He got cheated. He worked 7 more years. Okay, it worked out for him. I don't think it was a good choice. In other words, to delay one's life in order to live one's life. Think about that. Insofar as you can, live your life. Now, that doesn't mean that you don't make certain compromises. Now, there is one exception to that rule. As I say, I'm very contradictory. That is when it comes to one's close-in family. For my children, for my spouse, for other people, I will sacrifice myself insofar as I am able, and I am sometimes able. That's different, because that's flesh of your flesh, bone of your bone. And if you are a saint like Gandhi or King or something, maybe the family extends out, and you'll be able to do it for more than your blood relations. I'm not such a saint, but in regard to my family, I would do things I don't want to do for their sake. Except that that has not happened that often. And I feel that if I'm speaking to you now, and and you say, well, he's still vibrant, it's possibly because I have worked my whole life and I've labored very little of it.
Can I just?
Please.
Yes. So it's funny. I did not bring this because I knew that this conversation was going to go in this direction. I just happened to have it in my bag. It's Seneca on the shortness of life. Life is long if you know how to use it. And he says pretty much what Richard just was saying, which is don't waste time and do what you love. I happen to be one of those people who goes, so we were also having a conversation recently in the class I'm teaching this semester about the relationship between organ donation and pedagogy. So the flesh of my flesh, I have a little bit of a thing with my students in particular where I sometimes feel like the flesh of my flesh, it goes in certain directions that are not necessarily the literal ones. But so I have a little bit different philosophy on that myself, but I definitely am wholeheartedly a supporter of the work should be play philosophy, and they're also going to have to drag me out of the Department of Performance Studies kicking and screaming when it's time for my retirement, because we really do have a great time over there, and we play all the time, and that's part of what is beautiful, and I really do think that Richard really set up that cultural context within the department. It is pretty extraordinary. And one of the other texts that I love on this particular topic is the psychoanalytic theorist Bion, who says, who at a certain point was trying to train emerging psychoanalysts, and they were asking, how do you know who should be your analysand? And he said, well, I think really what you have to figure out is, is this somebody with whom you can make something beautiful in your atelier? And they were like, atelier? That's, he called his, the place where he did his psychotherapy, his atelier. And they said, well, okay, that's interesting, but and he said, you should really think of it like, is this somebody with whom I can make good art? And they said, well, what if you're not a particularly artistic person? And he said, well, then you really shouldn't be in that you should not be in this field. And then he said, but wait a second, I don't know what field you should be in, because if you don't see what you're doing as an art, then, so when you were saying, what it means to be a teacher, that our work is play, what it means to be an artist, our work is play, I certainly agree with you on those things. Of course, one would love to think that any occupation could become something that you would understand as an artistic practice. But so I guess I'm kind of pushing this in the direction of the question of art, partly because you guys invited us, even though you're coming from the medical professions, to think about what artists or people involved in the arts or the study of the arts might have to contribute to this. And I do think that somewhere along the line that's an important part of maybe.
Well, I think one of the big questions is whether art, however you want to construe the meaning of it, is superfluous or fundamental. Since in the West, since the 18th century, art has been framed and therefore been given a kind of surplus value, and therefore is superfluous except as it may be worth something. So when somebody looks at a Da Vinci drawing and pays umpteen $1 million for it, they're not seeing the drawing. Because if that same drawing was by Gus Jones, they wouldn't give so much money for it. And the name should not be the value, et cetera, et cetera. We know that. But if we look back at the periods or instances when art and instrumentality were conjoined, and it's true in medicine as well. When they were doing the first dissections in modern times in either Venice or Florence, they had the theater, which the medical students and surgeons came, and then they had the cadaver, and then they had the unfolding. And there's some beautiful drawings of the body, the it was kind of like stripping, the nakedness beyond nudity. If nudity is the surface of the body, then the nakedness is underneath it. And again, when is it Leonardo who draws these pictures of the muscles and so on. So at a certain point there, and I felt that Girardi, who operated on me, the nurse at the end of it, when I was in the ward, she says, "You're lucky he's an artist." That's exactly what she said to me. And I said, "What do you mean?" His stitches, the internal stitches, because my situation was complex because I had two valves. So they had to take the valve, the TAVR out. Then they had to remove the sutures of the first valve. So my heart, where's he going to put the sutures for this new one? And I knew that was going to be his problem. And she said, "He's beautiful at his stitching." That was reassuring to me. So what does beauty mean? Beauty means it means a number of things. I'm reading a book now called The Evolution of Beauty, Darwin Approach to Beauty. But one of the things that beauty means is the suitability of the process, the product, and the reception of the product. Now I'm getting a little theoretical here. So the beauty is when we feel there's a certain kind of harmony, even when we're dealing with things like cubism or so on, where there may be disharmony. But we feel that these things belong together. And they belong together in the process of their construction, the result of what the object is, and in the process of their reception. If we can say that there is a certain kind of flowing unity to that, it's kind of like looking at a beautiful bridge, like the George Washington Bridge. So it rises, it slopes, it rises, and it finishes, and you say, there's a beauty in this of totality. So that's one kind of beauty. And one could then say, what about the great chaos forms of beauty, Dada and so on and so forth. So those forms are also beautiful, but they're beautiful in reference to what they are not. In other words, Duchamp's urinal is not beautiful in the same, for me at least, in the same sense that a Picasso at one side of painting and let's say, well, I mentioned Da Vinci at another. The urinal, it's called fountain, is beautiful in terms of its reference. If we did not know its history, we would not know its, what's the art historical terms for it, term provenance. But certain other works, like what we find in the caves of Southwest Europe and some in Sulawesi, stand independent of their provenance. In other words, we need to figure out their provenance. If you look at Chauvet and the filmmaker's Cave of Forgotten Dreams, and you see the picture of the felines in Chauvet, the argument is, what's its provenance? That is, who made it? Why? What does it do? But there's no denying its beauty. And what does that mean? It kind of suits its place. And it says something to us uniquely human. I am very much an evolutionary biologist. I do feel the whales sing and the chimps sign and so on. But up to the present moment, at the level that we have it, we are studying them. They are not studying us. Charlton Heston, Planet of the Apes, be damned. So that there is something in the human enterprise which remains unique on this planet. I won't say unique in the galaxy or whatever, unique on this planet. And part of what remains unique is this ability to construct and see a wholeness. And that is what beauty is. I do feel that art in its largest sense, as well as in the smaller senses, need to be taught forever and ever, that they need to be introduced at all levels of education, from the very primary to the very last, to make it playful. And what does play mean in this sense? Play, when you have a play in the line of a fishing line, it means it's not pulled so tight that it can't go anywhere but where it's going. So there's a kind of looseness. Now, to return to the very beginning of our conversation, when I turn to Greek tragedy, and I've done several of them, I've done Oedipus, I've done in Seneca's translation, which is great. And Ted uses a version of it. But when I've done these tragedies, nothing could be less playful than they. In other words, it's very tight. Oedipus's fate is very tight. And yet I did Jocastas, which is a play that I wrote with Saviano Tedescu with 4 Jocastas. Said, look, we all pay attention to Oedipus. What about Jocasta? Who is she? And who might she have been? Who could she be? So I am always introducing, even into the most rigid of tragedies, the notion of play. And I feel that if I had a definition of what creativity would be, you know, whether it be gods or humans, it is the notion of play. It is the notion that it could be elsewise, and to some degree it is. And that's part of the thing that attracted me so deeply to Indian philosophy, the notion of Leela in Indian philosophy, to the notion of Maya and Leela. I don't want to go there, but I've spent a lot of time thinking and working in this notion, which is different than the Western, which goes, you know, according to the algorithm and syllogism, and the Indian goes in the direction of alternativity, that the world we're experiencing is one possible world. And so it's interesting when you see some of the most advanced physics proposing that there are infinite number of worlds, right? That this is just one possibility, or maybe this is happening someplace else at the same time. That feels weird to us, but very comfortable to anybody schooled in the Maya Lila tradition.
Are there other questions? Yeah.
Hold on, Josh.
I was just going to change gears for a minute and go back. I was intrigued by your statement about being asked to retire, and I think this is you know, an issue that certainly most, if not all of us, will face. And I wondered when that was, and why that was, and what that experience was about.
All right, well, it was very simple. Why? Because I drew a big salary, and they'd like to save it and spend it on other things. That was clear to me from the beginning. Why? And my salary would go up even by 1.5% or 2%. It would, you know. So that's why. They knew they wouldn't get me to retire just to say save NYU some money. So the process, as I told you, was to offer me what they call a ZIP loan, zero interest loan, which they give, I assume, not to everyone, in order for me to use it as part of a mortgage on an apartment, because I had a fabulous apartment, penthouse A of 1 Washington Square Village, with a cathedral ceiling, 3 terraces. It was beautiful. And I could have stayed in there, but you're not allowed, unless you're an ex-president, to stay in your apartment after you retire. There was a legal way I probably could have finessed that I could do it, but there were other pressures on me to buy a place instead. So the situation was extra about teaching, extra about my involvement in what my life had been, and much more an involvement in, you know, the future of 501Ks or whatever, you know, the finances of the last 20 or 30 years of my life. So that, and whether I wanted to fight with NYU about maintaining my apartment and still not own anything, or own something, et cetera, et cetera. So it was all extra. There's nothing fancy about it. It was real estate. And NYU got what it wanted. That is, they don't pay me my salary, though they pay me a little bit of my salary for editing TDR. And I got what my wife and I wanted, an apartment at a good rate. We'll have to pay back this money, but we have it for 10 years without any interest, which is an enormous saving, a non-interest mortgage for 10 years. At the end of the 10 years, which will come up, I think, in 2022, I'll see what I can do about further negotiating. I like negotiating. I'll call in Donald Trump. He'll strike a deal. But I mean, that really is. And given my druthers, could I have had the apartment, or could I have had guarantee that I could keep Penthouse A for my life and the lifetime of my wife? who was also a full professor, I probably would have stayed there. But that was not in the cards. So this seemed to me to be the best alternative. Now, on the positive side, I'm enjoying not doing some of these things. I'm even enjoying not teaching because it means I don't, you know, waiting for Godot, one of the great driving forces is that they have to be at a certain place at a certain time each week to wait for Godot. Well, that's the life of the professor. You have to be at a certain place at a certain time waiting for your students. Now, if you're playful about it, you love doing it. But there's also, you know, get back to this contradiction, sometimes you say, I don't want to be there. I don't want to do this teaching now. So what happens to me when that happens, when it happened, I didn't. But once I walk in the door, it changes. You see these faces, you interact, you have a good time. But so I'm glad now to be able to sit down and write, to think, to not be chained to that calendar. I miss the faculty meetings, but at a certain point I don't miss them. I mean, I would go to some and not to others if I guess emeritus gives me the right to go to some. But so it's a double thing. The move into this phase of life is for me the move into enormous opportunities. I have a lot of writing to do. I have 3 or 4 book contracts signed, but I haven't finished the books. I have an online course which was offered each spring, and I need to revise it. I have some artistic projects I want to do. I have invitations I am able to accept. Now, I'm aware that not everyone is me in this circumstance. Some people will retire, and they will, in a certain sense, retire to a kind of emptiness, or a nursing facility, or what have you. And I can't really address those problems. I wish there was some way socially for that not to happen. I think to some degree, I don't blame people. But insofar as you're able to play up to the point of retiring, you'll be able to play beyond it. Insofar as you are laboring up to retirement and your labor is taken away from you, you'll end up in a golf course and a nursing home together. Perhaps a nursing home that's a miniature golf course.
I'm told that we have about 5 more minutes, so maybe one last question? Yeah.
Well, we're supposed to go to 4 o'clock.
3:45.
Oh, 3:45. Okay.
Okay, so question, yes.
There were a number of comments made about contradictions, enjoying contradictions. The word aging incubator is perhaps a contradiction. You made some comments about how do we view ourselves when we think about the problems of growing older, or as a society, the problems of aging automatically packages this as a negative deal. Can you talk about some examples of how that could be better packaged, or who you think is doing a good job packaging it in a more positive way?
I'm so flattered that he gestured toward me, but there was something I was kind of wondering if I would have a chance to say. So I write fiction. And in the first novel that I published, there was the narrator has a lover, but doesn't want to reveal that lover's identity. So comes up with 4 different fictional identities. And one is a 68-year-old Israeli novelist woman. One is a 23-year-old experimental Vietnamese digital filmmaker. So the different identities of this lover are very different. But the one, which is this, so the narrator resembles me in many ways, resembles the author and the narrator of the book had a lot of similarities. So, but one of the potential lovers of this narrator was, as I said, a 68-year-old woman, and beautiful, long white hair, you know, very vivacious, sexy. And at a certain point, with each one of these fictional embodiments of the lover, things keep repeating so that you can see it's really one person, but it plays out across these different identities. So at one point, the best friend of the narrator says, Tzippi Honigman, which is the name of the character, makes you think there's nothing sexier than a woman in her 60s. And I wrote that And I didn't realize what I was doing for myself. I was in my 40s when I wrote it. And afterwards, I thanked myself for this gift because I so believed this, you know, and I was so in love with this particular embodiment of, you know, the sexiest person that you can imagine is this, you know, 68-year-old woman. And I thought, oh, I'm writing for myself this possibility of, you know, in 20 years, I will maybe, if I'm lucky, achieve this, you know, gorgeousness of this particular character. So, and I had no idea that that at a certain level I was doing it for myself. And I think, you know, and then in retrospect, I said, oh, I was doing that for some other people too, you know. But when I asked that question to Richard about art, you know, what is it about artists that might be able to answer some of these questions about the problem of aging? One of the things is, I think that the imaginative capacity to envision ways of approaching the problem of aging, not as a problem, but to think of it, to be able to imagine, and Eros is nothing but, you know, a kind of a place where we take the imaginary and take that ball and run with it. So.
Well, to take the other side of it to some degree in terms of our society, because of the way we've structured our families, because of the way we've idealized the notion of youth, we've more or less said that after a certain age or after a certain facility, you know, mental facility, physical facility, we want you to die. If you're not going to die, we will store you in places to die. There are many of them out there. Actually, I was almost sent to one at the end of my surgery called a rehab, a certain kind of rehab. And I found out that a lot of people were, quote, permanent residents there. And I rejected that strongly. So I do feel that as a society, because of our cultural fear of aging and dying, because of our weakened extended family structure. Yes, we see all these Christmas ads and Thanksgiving ads, but truly we don't live in extended families or compounds, as in like in Indonesia, where generations live together in compounds and so on. We have two kinds of profound segregation in this country. We have de facto racial segregation, and we have de facto ageist segregation. And the problems should be thought of as parallel, that one represents racism, one represents ageism, and the solutions may also be parallel to some degree. But there's no doubt in my mind, and I'm not just saying American society, certain form of Western individualism, the way it's worked itself out, is probably this way, combined with industrialization, that there is always a mechanistic solution to a spiritual or non-materialist problem. And the mechanistic solution is to package, to have storehouses of the waiting to die people. And now, obviously, there's a question of Alzheimer's and other dementias and so on. But I'm convinced that with proper engagement, the number of such things, it's kind of like drug addiction and the inner city. There's no doubt there's a lot of addiction, or drug addiction in Appalachia. But the question is, what are the circumstances that give rise to this? So there's no doubt that there's a lot of dementia. But I think I would love to see studies of Indonesian families, what percentage of their old people are in dementia, or Chinese families if they are intact. Because I feel that part of what dementia is the reaction to being abandoned at a profound level, and the sense, if you're not going to pay attention to me, I cannot pay attention to you, and this profound rejection. So I think the state of old people is not the state of us. We are, as Stendhal said, among the happy few, and there are myriads of miserable, which we need to pay attention to.
I think we may be at time. Are we at time?
4 minutes, but
Yes? Should we say thank you to Richard?
Well, thank you. We're going on the road with this.
Well, thank you, everybody, so much for attending our first of what will hopefully be many speaker series. And on behalf of the NYU Aging Incubator, we want to please accept our sincere appreciation for doing this today. Your experiences and certainly your discussions were certainly very stimulating, and your insights on performing, not performance, are quite fascinating. And so we want to present you both with, both you, Richard and Barbara, with gifts of appreciation.
Thank you. I think we.
No, I think they're the same.
Oh, okay. Oh,
I
I
think
see.
they're-
I saw the picture. Oh, okay. I saw a picture.
I know
and
it has to be identical.
Okay.
I think they are identical.
It has to be.
All right. I just
And-
saw his face.
And I saw you.
You're right. Yep, exactly. Thank you so much.
Thank you
You're
so
welcome.
very much.
It's really a pleasure.
And I want to be sure, we hope to see you all at our next speaker series event with celebrated Tisch animator John Canemaker, as well as our renowned film curator John Gartenberg. And this will take place on January 25th next year, which is coming up shortly. So I'd now like to invite everybody next door to room 406 for a reception. So thank you again, everybody. For
And
attending.
I would like to thank the organizers, and I would like to thank all of you for participating, and a special thanks to my dear colleague Barbara for such a lively, profound engagement. So thank you all.
Ditto.